بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Alhamdulillah, this is lesson number 4, correct? And so far we have learned the mabadi, or the foundational matters that pertain to the science of Aqidah. We learned al-mabadi al-ashara, the 10 foundational matters, the definition of the term Aqidah, the fruits, the benefits, the subject matter, the ruling of the lawgiver concerning it, the founder of the science or founders of the science. And we went through the introduction to the text, which is a dibaj, a kind of ornamentation, which is fairly typical for any books written on Islamic topics. The authors will begin with the basmala, and they begin with praising Allah Ta'ala and sending prayers and salutations upon the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. We covered that. And in our previous class, we looked at the first obligation a person has when they attain the age of legal moral accountability. We talked about, number 1, when that occurs, and number 2, what is the actual nature of that obligation. As the line in the poem says, that your first duty at onset of youth is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to know Him. And we talked about that as it relates to coming of age and really knowing Allah versus parroting what we've received by our parents or our society, if we have grown up in a Muslim majority society. From there we segued into a discussion on the ruling of the muqallid, the ruling on the person who is the conformist, the person who repeats what has been transmitted to them through their parents or society without knowing the proofs. And we talked about the difference between taqleed in matters of law, fiqh, and taqleed in matters of aqidah. We spoke about the difference between these two and how, as it concerns taqleed in matters of law, that is the duty of the person who is not a mujtahid, the person who has not attained the rank of ijtihad, where they are qualified to approach the primary textual sources directly. That person who hasn't attained that rank is obliged to follow qualified scholarship, because the levels of details in law are far too complex for a person to approach independent of having mastery through those who have gained mastery, and so on. But as it pertains to Aqidah is not so complicated that we have to just trust what other people say. If you go to a mufti, a qualified mufti who inspires confidence, who has the recognition of other qualified scholars who are well known, and you ask that mufti a question, is ABC halal or haram, whatever issue it may be, when they give you the ruling, you're not required to know the legal proofs and the legal arguments back and forth and the ins and outs of these rulings. It is enough for you and me to simply take that ruling and, for lack of a better words, run with it, because we have done our duty as believers. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Allah says, ask the people of knowledge if you do not know. But you can't go to a mufti and ask them about Allah and just believe whatever they tell you. You have to know for yourself. That's the difference between taqleed in law and taqleed in aqeedah. The majority of matters in law are dhanni, meaning this is why there's differences of opinion. They're dhanni, they're speculative, in that they all don't reach the degree of certainty that you have with 1 + 1 = 2. Whereas aqeedah, that's the level of certainty you're aiming for. So you don't settle with just going with what other people say. And so we talked about the ruling of the muqallid according to the ulama. And we mentioned historically there's been a great deal of debate about that kind of person. What's their ruling concerning them? And we transmitted a few different views. And the majority view, the settled upon view among the majority of the ulama, is that if a person has the ability to examine the proofs, to engage in the contemplation and reflection to arrive at that understanding, yet they fail to do so, they are sinful for that neglect. They're sinful for not doing that. And they're still Muslim, provided whatever they're parroting, whatever they've taken, is actually congruent with reality, is actually true. If a person simply follows what their parents say and they believe it, but they don't know the detailed reasons why, they haven't really looked into it themselves, then their faith is sound as long as they maintain that and what they believe is correct. But we want to get past that. Especially in this day and age, as we said, one can no longer get away with just parroting what they learned without having a deeper understanding. So we talked about knowledge, because that's what we're aiming for here. Knowledge is not the same thing as parroting what we receive from our parents or what we receive from society. So we talked a bit about knowledge in the previous class toward the end. We looked at the general definition of knowledge and the specific definition of knowledge as it pertains to our study of aqeedah. So who can remind us what is the general understanding or definition of knowledge? So there's a word used. So the word in Arabic, does anyone remember it? The word for this definition? No, that's the word. The word itself is ilm, but we're defining it as idrak. Idrak al-shay ala ma huwa alayh. The key word here in the definition is idrak, which we said is to have access, to attain unto that thing, to access it, right? So it is to access knowledge, to access that thing as it truly is. Idrak is the important word here. When you don't have access to something, you don't really know it. What's in my right pocket? I'm putting the question out again today. Yalla. What's the answer? Okay. Okay, what prevents you from knowing? You don't have access. You don't have access. Now, last class, someone correctly guessed that it was a set of keys. Now, is that called knowledge?
Not again all complete. This was kind of there's a little bit doubt there.
They may not be doubting, they may be pretty sure, but it's not knowledge, as we'll see, because they still lacked access. So we'll get to that, inshallah. طيب.
I have still one thing to ask.
Sure.
When you say adraka, is adraka and muhit? No, sorry. Adraka and ahata is same meaning? So there is a difference.
There's a difference. Ihata is to have an encompassing, comprehensive access. We can have knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but there's no ihata. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنْ عِلْمِهِ. Right? No one has access to the encompassing knowledge of the divine, and no one has access in that sense. But we have access in that we have knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes. It can be, but in this definition, we're talking about it as access. Realization, if we look at it, because we're talking about aqidah and we're looking at terms, the corresponding term for realization will be tahqiq or ma'rifah. And tahqiq could be a synonym for this. That's true. If it's ma'rifah, that's a little more dhawqi, experiential. Generally, yeah. Idrak is to have access, to have a means of attaining something, to have a means of reaching, right? To reach something, attain it, and so on. So, if I ask you what is in my pocket, you can guess. A guess is picking one of several possibilities. But without access, you cannot make a statement based on ilm, on knowledge. Because you could be right in your guess, you could be wrong in your guess. In either case, it's not knowledge, because you lacked access to that thing. The only thing that will secure against error is access. And that access is attained through dalil, through proof. That's the access. When you have a dalil, you have access, right? So, the only thing that secures against these different types of pseudo-knowledge that are masquerading as knowledge or not the opposite of knowledge is having access, dalil. So, let's see what is in my pocket. Wouldn't you know? It's a face mask. Now, how do you know it's a face mask now? You can see it. You have access. What if someone wasn't here in this class today and you went home, called them and said, the teacher went through this definition of knowledge and what it means in relation to access. He asked the class what's in his pocket. Finally, he pulled out a face mask. Does that person have knowledge now? They have knowledge. How do they have knowledge now? Did they see it? It's because you're all trustworthy. It's khabr sadiq. It's a true report. It's been transmitted to them from someone speaking the truth. So they have access to it by means of the report that came to them, even though they didn't see it themselves. That's another way of knowing, right? So these are different ways of knowing, and this is what forms our epistemology, that big word we introduced in the last class, which is how we know what we know. What we call in Arabic, wasa'ilul ma'rifah. And you'll also see in contemporary Arabic works, epistemologia, which they've taken from the English and put into Arabic. Now, when I asked you what was in my pocket, and you didn't know, maybe you had in your mind an idea, maybe it's a set of keys, maybe it's a wallet, and I pulled out this face mask. Notice now the difference you have between your level of understanding before and after I showed that it's a face mask. Now that you have access, you have conviction. Maybe it was a set of keys. And maybe in your mind you're thinking, it's a set of keys again. And you think you know. And let's say I pulled out a set of keys. It would have confirmed your thought. But notice, even then, the conviction you have after would be much stronger than the conviction you had before. Because now you have immediate access. When you have immediate access, this idrak, you don't have to muster yaqeen. You don't have to create yaqeen in yourself. It's automatic because you have direct access. And that is what we wish to have as we study the science of aqeedah. to learn in such a way where we have direct access through dalil, so that we have conviction and we don't have to burden ourselves with developing yaqeen. We have it already. أَفِي اللَّهِ شَكْ فَاطِرِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Allah says, is there any doubt about Allah, the creator of the heavens and the earth? So what we're seeking in the study of Aqidah is ilm, knowledge, access to the content of faith that we're learning about. That access enables us to have yaqeen, conviction in what is congruent with reality through means that are unimpeachable, as we'll learn. Now on the board, we have at the top ilm, and before we move along, we want to go to that second definition. Now, in the last class, we talked about the general definition of knowledge, إدراك الشيء على ما هو عليه, to have access to something as it truly is. And we said that in the science of Aqidah, they give a different definition, and that definition is in Arabic. Does anyone remember the English translation of it? What the definition of it is in the science of Aqidah?
Conviction of something that matches reality.
Excellent. الجزم المطابق للواقع عن دليل. There are three elements to this. The first is jazm, which is conviction. The second is that it is mutabiq. And mutabiq means that it matches reality, or it's congruent with reality, with things as they really are. An dalil, based on a proof, which we could reword that and say based on an unimpeachable means of access, having real access. So when we say we have to have knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His attributes and the messengers and their attributes and the transmitted things, it means that we have to have conviction that is congruent with reality and based on proof. If a person has conviction, but their conviction doesn't match reality, then that itself is not enough. Every person of fervor who follows any religion or any ideology has jazm. They have certainty in what they believe in, but it doesn't match reality. Some people worship idols. Some people believe that God is 3 in 1, and they have certainty about this. They have what they feel is conviction, but it doesn't match reality. Some people have conviction, and that conviction matches reality. Really strong Muslims, believing Muslims. However, they've never really studied the science of Aqidah or done any kind of investigation or reflection, so they don't have it through dalil. And that's the muqallid, who has certainty. And we said in the previous class that for that person to escape taqleed, for them it's really simple. They just need to reflect on the cosmos and that everything that is created requires a creator. Just that reflection alone takes them from taqleed into ilm, because that's the reflection. That's using their aql to arrive at that conclusion. But we're looking at it from a deeper level. So al-jazm al-mutabiq lil-waqi' an dalil. Conviction that matches reality based on proof. Now, there are things that masquerade as knowledge or stand in place of knowledge, but which do not count as knowledge. Some of these are opposites of knowledge. Some of them are contraries of knowledge. So we want to look at these so we have an understanding of what knowledge is and what it is not, and what each of them look like. So we have here on the board the things that are not knowledge. And in order, they are jahl, dhann, shak, wahm, and taqleed. Who knows, what does jahl mean in English? Ignorance. Ignorance. Ignorance, we'll go through these just briefly and then we'll start one by one. Jahl is ignorance. Number 2, dhann. Who knows what dhann means? Guessing. I mean, I put it there in the English. Now, dhann can mean suspicion. It can mean guesswork. It can mean conjecture. That's the meaning of dhann. Sometimes dhann in the Quran actually comes with the meaning of certainty. And this is because the word dhann is a special type of word in Arabic. It is among the words that they call the adad, the words that have opposite meanings. So sometimes dhann can mean certainty, sometimes it can mean conjecture. الَّذِينَ يَظُنُّونَ أَنَّهُمْ مُلَاقُو رَبِّهِمْ. Those who believe with certainty that they are meeting their Lord. But the standard meaning is guess or conjecture. The third one is shak. And shak is, of course, doubt. The fourth one, wahm. Wahm has the meaning of illusion at times. It has the meaning of, it's like a conjecture, but it's really, really strong conjecture. You know, if we're looking at guessing, dhann is a guess that is closer to being true, and wahm is a guess that is closer to being false. But they're both not knowledge. And then the last one we've covered, and that is taqleed, conformism, dogma, following others without having sound knowledge of it on one's own. So we want to look at these individually and how they are masquerading or the opposites of knowledge. So the first one is jahl or ignorance. And ignorance is the opposite of knowledge. And there are two types of ignorance in general. We don't just say in Islam. There are two types of ignorance. The first one is called jahl basit, which is simple ignorance. And the second one is compound ignorance, jahl murakkab. So, I ask you again, I don't have it. What's in my left pocket? What's in my left pocket? You don't know. When you say you don't know, that is simple ignorance. That's a good place to be in. Because a person who says they don't know, they're acknowledging they don't know. They don't have access. That's jahl basit, a simple ignorance. You just don't know. Compound ignorance is when I ask you to guess what's in my pocket, you say, it's a cell phone, or it's a this or a that, and you're really guessing. You don't know, but you're acting as if you do know, right? What is the capital of Georgia? And you say, it's Columbus. I know it. No, that's not true. You don't know, and you don't know that you don't know. So that is compound ignorance. Because there's ignorance of the question, of the real answer, and ignorance of one's own ignorance of it. That's why it's compound. We say compound because the ignorance is on two levels. Ignorance concerning the question, and ignorance concerning one's own ignorance about it. Now sadly, most people who are described with jahl have this type of jahl, compound ignorance. If only people who didn't know had simple ignorance. Because a person with simple ignorance is really in their default setting as a human being. Our default setting is we don't know lots of things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that it is He who took you from the wombs of your mothers, لا تعلمون شيئا, without knowing anything. So our default setting is jahl basit. That's a good place to be. And Jahl Basit is really the model student in a classroom, because they come, especially when there's a willingness to learn, they are an empty cup waiting to be filled. On the other hand, the compound ignorant person their cup is full. You can't tell them anything because they're sure. Dealing with simple ignorance is very easy. Dealing with compound ignorance is quite hard, but in either case, you cannot build iman on either. You cannot build iman on simple ignorance or compound ignorance. But between the two, it's far better to have simple ignorance of a thing than compound ignorance, because you have to be corrected, you have to remove those mistakes in understanding, and then take what is true. But with simple ignorance, your cup is empty and you can receive. So moving along to things that sometimes seem like knowledge but they're not. We said that jahl is the opposite of ignorance. Now we come to something that sometimes feels like knowledge. It's knowledgey feeling, but it's not knowledge. And that is dhann. Dhann, in its technical meaning, in the science of aqidah or epistemology, properly speaking, it is an opinion that matches reality. So the mutabaqa, that matching of reality, is there. But it is an opinion, because the person did not have the dalil, they did not have access. Right? If you correctly guessed that I had a face mask in my pocket, or a set of keys, or a wallet last class, you correctly guessed that there was that thing in my pocket, but that's not coming from a place of yaqeen, because you didn't have access. It happened to be a true guess. So the reality is, it's just an extension of jahl. It's an extension of ignorance because you didn't have access. You just happened to be right. You could have been wrong. Yes?
Guman is also close to zan.
Is what?
Guman is also close to zan.
I
The
did.
word guman. That's a Urdu word. Yeah.
It's an Urdu word?
Yes.
What is that word?
Guman. Guman. I will never heard.
I don't know.
It's okay.
No. So we said that it's an extension of jahl because you still don't have access. You just happen to get it right this time through guessing. It's a different flavor, really. Now we come to another thing that masquerades. Or it's not really masquerading. It's not knowledge. And that is shak. Dhann can masquerade as knowledge because the person's making a statement. It is this and that. And they could be true. They could be correct, but they didn't have access. On the other hand, shak is simply doubt. The person is 50-50. They don't know. They don't have access, and they're not sure if it's this way or that way. Could be right, could be wrong. They're in doubt about the matter. They don't know. They're unsure. A person with shak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not even a Muslim. A person who has doubt about Allah ta'ala is not a Muslim. So, another thing that is definitely not knowledge. Though we should add here something really important, and that is, shak here is defined as doubt, where a person says, maybe Allah exists, maybe He doesn't, I don't know. That's doubt. I'm doubting, I'm unsure. That kind of doubt is not the same thing as a person who is disturbed from an argument they hear that they cannot answer. Sometimes a person may speak with different people or see something and it puts them in a state of disturbance. They're disquieted, but they don't know how to reply to something. So they feel a little bothered by that until they get an answer. That's not the same thing. That's just not having the answer or the ability to furnish an answer to a question. And that would remain until a person seeks an answer. But doubt here is simply being unsure. Maybe X, maybe Y, maybe yes, maybe no. 50-50. That's shak. The next one is wahm. And that is, we said, conjecture, illusion, or wrong guess. It is really a corollary of dhann. If dhann is a true guess, wahm is a false guess or a wrong guess. This person lacks access and they give the wrong answer. They guessed and they got it wrong. The person who has dhann guessed and got it right. They're closer to the haqq because at least they got it right. But they still lack access. And this person likewise lacks access. Now going to the last type, that's taqleed. And we said, we already explained this. Conformism or dogma. We said that this is following the view of another without having knowledge of the proof, which works for fiqh, in which we're not required to go into all of the details. But it does not work in the realm of aqeedah. One has to know for themselves. And taqleed, being dogma, it's not knowledge at all. Now, we want to remove from ourselves, in the study of aqeedah, all forms of taqleed, all forms of wahm, wrong guesses. And inshallah, there's no shak at all. And then we want to remove any dhann that we have, and any jahl, whether it's compound or simple. And when we have true ilm, it removes all of those things. So for these, when you look at each of them, you see that they each bring certain signs, certain telltale signs. The person with jahl tends to be a certain way. The person with dhann tends to be a certain way. The person with shak or wahm or taqleed tends to be a certain way. The person who has jahl, if it's simple, there should be an openness to learn. There should be an openness to grow. If there's not, then there's probably some taqleed in there too. If a person is making true guesses, they have dhann and not knowledge, one of the signs is that they lack conviction. But they are in a good place in that they can build on the dhann, because the guess is already true. They can build on it with proof and attain yaqeen, attain certainty, certain knowledge. So that is learning so that it is not accidentally true, but purposely true, because they have access. The person who has shak, this person is unsure, and they tend to just withhold judgment. I don't know. I don't know. The agnostic would be a person of shak, and we're going to talk about this agnostic type toward the end. The agnostic person, the person with shak, says, I don't know. There's indecisiveness. Often there's an indifference as well. They don't really care to know, so they say they're unsure, and they don't even care to find out if something is true or not. They're satisfied with where they are. The category of wahm, the conjecture, the illusion, the wrong guess, this is the person who has false beliefs. So out of all of these, even if we say that taqleed, wahm, dhann are all flavors of ignorance, wahm is the one category that contains the most people. Most human beings who have incorrect understandings about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are people of wahm. All people who worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all people of kufr, they are basing their beliefs on wahm. They have convictions based on what is other than true evidence. And we're going to talk about all of that. Yes?
People who have done, a straight line, not short. Shut. A straight, not short, in the middle. So why those people are like you were saying they are like to be in that state. Although it's painful, you don't know it's in between. Why don't they try to come out? Why they're satisfying them? They want to be in that state.
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to the agnostics, because that's coming up toward the end. The last one, taqleed, we talked about this before. We said that's when the person who essentially says, I don't have to know for myself, I'll just follow what person XYZ says. And this is basically dogma, because they're just following forefathers. It's arbitrary, and it often comes with a certain false conviction, because it's based on a fallacious appeal to authority, an appeal to their forefathers, appeal to family, appeal to society. This is a fallacious appeal. It's not a true appeal, because this has to be based on more than just that. But with that comes a certain energy of wishing to defend that appeal, because it is, after all, one's forefathers, one's society, and so on. So there comes with this kind of ta'assub, this bigotry. Now, in studying Aqidah, we wish to remove from ourselves all forms of taqleed, wahm, shak, dhann, jahl, so that we attain true ilm, true knowledge, which, as we said, is to have access to things as they truly are, to have conviction that matches reality based on dalil. Now, dalil, if dalil is evidence, we understand there's different types of evidence. There's different ways of knowing what we know. In the example of the face mask that I removed from my pocket, once you saw it, you had access. So your dalil is your vision, your seeing it. And if the person who missed class today is told that I took out a face mask, they come to knowledge of it through a true report, khabar sadiq, something you told them, and you're trustworthy and they believe you. Now, these two are forms of proof, or they're ways of knowing. However, they're not 100% airtight. Because maybe this is on a face mask. Maybe this is a piece of cloth that I made to look like a face mask, or maybe it's an optical illusion. Maybe it's a hologram. Maybe it could be anything. Maybe the khabar, the report that so-and-so heard from another person wasn't entirely true. Or maybe the person is truthful, but they thought they saw a face mask when it wasn't. So they tell the person, I saw a face mask, when in fact it was a napkin. But they thought it was a face mask. So in both of these cases, the means of access, the hiss, the sensory perception, or the true report, they are means of knowing, but they're not unimpeachable. They're not airtight. So when we want to have knowledge of these things in the content of Aqidah, we want to have knowledge based on a proof that is 100% ironclad and airtight, that gives us absolute certainty. And we're going to be covering that in the next class, maybe a little bit today. But before we can talk about what that looks like, we have to look at the different ways we arrive at judgments about things around us, and reality, and cause and effect, and so on. And this is where we talk about judgments. What's a judgment? When you judge something, make a judgment about something, you're making a claim. You are making an assertion. You are saying that something is this, or something is that, or something is not this, or is not that. So the judgment is the proposition. The hukum is the proposition, the claim. It is the ascription, the nisbah. It's a statement. And it's really important to understand this. And I'll give you some concrete examples why once we cover it. The judgment is how we make a claim about anything. Right? Let's think of a really simple claim. There's a bottle of water on the table over here. Now, does water quench thirst if you're thirsty? Right, it does. When it's cold outside and you put on a jacket, the jacket warms you up, right? So you say, the jacket warms me up. The water quenches my thirst. That's a judgment. Now, we know that's true because of experience. Because virtually every time we drink water, it quenches our thirst. We know that if we take something and lift it into the air and drop it, it's going to drop to the ground. Gravity. We know that through observation. That's a judgment based on experience, and we're going to learn about that. Another kind of judgment would be to say, it is haram to drink alcohol. That's also a hukum. A judgment is drinking alcohol is haram. Now, that's not the same kind of judgment as saying water quenches thirst. That's a legal judgment, a judgment of Sharia. The first judgment is a scientific, empirical judgment about cause and effect, what we observe. If I say 1 + 1 = 2, is that something that you're observing outside of yourself through experimentation? No. Is that a legal ruling in Sharia? No. It's a rational judgment. So there's different kinds of judgments. And we're going to learn all three. The most important of these three types will be the rational judgment. And we have to spend a certain amount of time with that before we can understand the text. And that's when we go to the next lines of poetry. But first, before we even look at the types of judgments, we have to understand what a judgment is in the first place. So the definition of a judgment, or you could call it a proposition, a claim, an assertion, is إثبات أمر لأمر أو نفيه عنه. This is in the words of Imam as-Sanusi. He says that the hukum, the judgment, is to ascribe one thing to another or negate one thing from another. On the board it reads a little differently. Ascribing one thing to another or negating it therefrom. So, the thing is the amr, whatever that may be. And here we have two key words, ithbat and nafi, affirming something or negating something. Right? So look at the example on the board. It says, A is B. That could be anything. A is B. Now notice that the word is in brackets. That word is, in the brackets, is the nisbah. It's the relation between A and B. It's the thing that connects A to B. A is B. So the nisbah is between these two things, through is. And that's ithbat, that's an affirmation, or a direct ascription. If you go to the second example, it says A is not B. The same thing is going on. It's an ascription. There's a nisbah. Is not in the brackets there. Is an ascription, but it's a negation. As we see through the word not. A is not B. Let's look at an example. Zayd is standing. Zayd is in the position of A. Is the nisbah, the ascription, which is here an affirming ascription. And standing is in place of B. You have affirmed that Zayd is standing. The judgment you're making, the claim you're making is that Zayd is standing. Right? If you use a negation, it'll look the same. Zayd is not standing. So again, Zayd is A, the nisbah is not, and it's a negation of what? Standing. Right? So this hukum comes, this is very important, this hukum comes before any confirmation about whether it's true or not. The hukum comes before there's any confirmation. Is Zayd really standing? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know yet. That depends on what? Dalil. Depends on proof. What's the evidence that he's standing? When you make a hukum, it doesn't automatically become true. Just because you say Zayd is standing doesn't mean it's automatically true. Just because you say Zayd is not standing doesn't make it automatically true. The hukum has to be made before you can supply evidence in support of it. We don't put the cart before the horse by providing proof for something that hasn't been affirmed or denied. It's the affirmation or the negation followed by what supports that hukum, what supports that proposition being made. It is a claim. It's not a confirmation. We will take the hukum and then we examine it. If someone makes a hukum, a judgment, maybe it's an ethical claim that A is bad. After we hear that, we take the hukum, then we examine and see, is A truly bad? Or maybe they say that it's an empirical claim. This causes cancer. Eating this food causes cancer. That's a hukum as well. It's an empirical claim that enough observation has been made to rule that doing this will lead to that. That requires proof, but we have to hear the hukum first and then search for the evidence. And the same thing for a rational judgment. If you say 1 plus 1 plus 7 plus 10 is whatever, especially because it's not 1 plus 1. If it's self-evident, it's different. But if it's 1 plus 1 plus 7 plus 5 minus 4, you have to think about that for a moment and figure out what's the correct answer before you can say that hukum is correct or incorrect. So the hukum, the judgment or the proposition, as we see it here, it's actually quite simple. A is B or A is not B. But obviously we don't speak in that simple kind of language all the time. Most of our judgments are a lot more complex than that. If you say, for example, I like coffee, that's a simple hukum. Now that doesn't really require proof because you're merely expressing an internal preference. But if I say the car is from Germany, so the car is A, is the nisbah, from Germany is B, that needs some proof. What's the proof? If I say this Toyota Highlander is from Germany, that's not true. It's a Japanese car, but maybe it was built here. Who knows? But that's a hukum. But notice that it gets a little more complex. As the sentence gets longer, the A is still there and the B is still there, but the nisbah between them can become more complex. And that's why we have to really understand what we're reading and hearing. So you could say, for example, summertime is more enjoyable for children than winter. That's also a hukum, but it's more complex. Summertime is more enjoyable for children than winter. Same hukum is here, but it's more complex grammatically. So we have to seek, well, what is the proof for that? Is that true or is that false? But the ascription is still being made that A, summer, is B, for children, more than something else, C, is for children. It gets more complex. If you say Afghan rugs are more expensive than Persian rugs, or nicer than Persian rugs, same thing. A, the nisba, the ascription, to B. So
I'm a little lost because, like, when I'm looking, your first statement, when you say something like summertime is, like, because I'm thinking in English terms, that's an opinion, right? Like, if you say something like summertime is more enjoyable for children versus, it all depends on, that's an opinion. For some children, summer is.
Right.
And then when you say, like for instance, when I'm teaching children, I teach them, this is an opinion, this is a fact.
Opinion, a hukum can be an opinion, it can be a fact, it can be a lie. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
We're looking at the structure of it. Ascertaining its truth value comes after. So that's, if a person says, the person is, if I said to you right now, I am a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. That's a hukum. I am is the nisba, B, direct descendant of Genghis Khan. It's still a hukum, even though obviously it's not true. Saying that summertime is more enjoyable for children than wintertime, it's still a hukum, even if that's an opinion that I have and there's no evidence for it, or the data is really sketchy, right? So the truth value of the hukum comes after, right? Everything that people say, every claim they make, opinions, what they believe are facts, what they tell as a truth, what they tell intentionally as a lie, whatever any person of any ideology, any religion, any political party, what they're all saying, these are all hukum. They're all propositions. A proposition can be true, it could be false, it could be a lie. The point is, when you make a hukum, when you make an affirmation between an ascription between A and B, you have to back it up. That's the key thing here. You have to back it up. There has to be evidence supporting that proposition, no matter what it is. So, and this actually leads to the discussion on atheism and agnosticism and the misuse of language. And the hukum here gives us a way of responding to those types of people. You had a question?
So when you say when it's get A and B more complex,
Pardon?
When it's get more complex, the statement,
Yes.
whenever they get more complex, so it means they are mostly they need examination, which will bring out the proof, and then it will be.
Well, that's the subject of logic. The science of logic, mantiq, is really about understanding how to parse these statements and understand definitions and understand the structure of proofs and propositions so that you can understand what is true and what is not, and what's a faulty argument and what's a true argument. The point we're focusing on now is just what is a hukum to begin with. Now, how does this apply in Aqeedah? Well, I'll give you a few examples. Let's take the example of the atheist and the agnostic. The atheist, I'll leave it. The atheist is a person who does not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They say, there is no God. Is that a hukum? Right. Where's the A? In their statement, there is no God, or God does not exist. So God would be in the category of A, does not, that's the nisba, it's a negation, and exist. So looking at the definition of hukum, ascribing one thing to another or negating it therefrom. So here it will be negating one thing from another. Negating existence from God. Saying God does not exist. Right? That is a hukum. Whenever a person makes a hukum, they're making a claim. They're saying, this is not that. Or this is that. That's a hukum. Whenever a person makes a hukum, they have to justify it. They have to prove it. But the problem here, if you've ever dealt with atheists, you'll have some experience. They usually say, after they tell you they don't believe in God, they say, I don't have to prove God. They act as if disbelieving in God is the default position, and the burden of proof is on you people who believe in God. They say, I don't have to prove anything. You say that God exists, you have to prove it. I don't have to prove anything. And then you tell them, slow down. You're making a claim. You're saying God does not exist. You're not saying, I don't know. You're saying God does not exist. They act as if they are on neutral ground and do not have to justify their hukum, their proposition, their claim that God does not exist. So they have to be told, before you can even talk about proofs, you have to sit down with them and say, listen, you are making a claim, and that claim has to be backed up with proof. Whether you're proving, whether your claim is an affirmation, an ithbat, or whether it is a negation, nafi, if you're making the hukum, you have to back it up. You can't act as if you can say God does not exist, and that's a neutral statement that does not require proof. That requires proof. The person who said God exists is making a hukum too. They also require proof, for sure. But likewise, the atheist requires proof for them to say God does not exist. Now what happens if the atheist is trying to have a legitimate conversation and they're willing to listen to the other person, and that other person explains to them that you're making a hukum and you have to back it up? They will often backtrack. They'll often acknowledge that you're right. I am making a claim in the negative, and that claim has to be backed up. So they then retreat, or they'll often retreat to a position of agnosticism. What is an agnostic? The agnostic is the person who says, I don't know. I don't know. They'll say, I don't know. I haven't seen, heard, tasted, touched, smelled. I have no access. I have no way of knowing about the existence of Allah. They limit knowing to the sense perception. They limit it to the hawas. And they say, oh, I don't know. Now that's agnosticism, saying, or a person says, I don't know if God exists. But here's the thing. Very seldom will an agnostic just say, I don't know. They will very often add something to that. What will they say? I don't know if God exists, and it can't be known. They'll add this. It can't be known. I don't know if God exists, and it's not important. It's not relevant to my life, or it's not really a big deal for anyone. So here's the issue. when the atheist makes a claim saying God does not exist, that requires proof because they're making a claim. When an agnostic says, I don't know if God exists, are they making a claim? Think about it. The agnostic says, I do not know if God exists. They're making a claim. But so if the claim is an ascription between two things, what is the ascription here? Is it to God or is it to themselves? It's to themselves. What they're ascribing is ignorance to themselves. They're saying, I do not know if God exists. So the hukum is not directly to God. It is to their own ignorance about the existence of God. They can make that claim about themselves. It's their own internal experience. They don't have to really back that up because they're simply expressing what's inside of them. They're making a hukum regarding their own ignorance, their own jahal. But here's the thing. Once a person has made a hukum about their own ignorance, they no longer are given the chance to offer any other statements about the matter. They've canceled that. They've forfeited any chance to add anything to the conversation once they have negated knowledge from themselves. It's like saying, I don't know anything about fixing a car, but this is how you should change the motor out. Wait a minute, you've already said you don't know, so you've lost that chance to make any other suggestions or give any hot takes or opinions about what I should do with the engine of the car. Likewise here, if a person says, I don't know if God exists, they don't have any position to make another hukum about the matter, such as saying it's not important, or it's Allah Ta'ala it's not possible. No one can know the existence of God. So it's okay if a person negates knowledge from themselves, but once they've done that, they can no longer add anything to the conversation that is a hukum of affirmation or negation. They've already said they don't have knowledge, they don't have access, they have no evidence. What more can they add? So this is how we understand a hukum. Affirming one thing for another thing, or negating one thing from another thing. No matter what it is, no matter what form it takes, any hukum requires evidence to back it up. A person is not allowed to make a claim that A is B, and when pressed for evidence, says, I don't need to give evidence. You have to give evidence that A is not B. No. If you're saying that A is B, you have to substantiate that. You have to prove it somehow. That doesn't become neutral ground where others have to counter with their own proof. You have to also provide proof for your statement. If a person says A is not B, likewise they have to prove that because they're making a claim. This is important because in the case of atheists, we see that they are making a claim. The atheist position is not a neutral position that God doesn't exist and that those who say that He does, the burden of proof is on them and not on us. The burden of proof is on them as much as it is on those who affirm the belief in God. Both are required to furnish proof. And the agnostic who says, I don't know, is also making a hukum, but it's a hukum about their own ignorance. After doing so, they don't have any opportunity or right to give an additional hukum because they've already affirmed that they don't know anything about the matter. In Aqidah, what we learn before we study the actual content of the Aqidah, we're learning what is knowledge, how to think, and we're learning about the judgments that we're making in Aqidah. When we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has certain attributes, that we're talking about the proofs of Allah's existence and the attributes. These are all judgments. All judgments, all propositions require proofs. And we're going to look at the different types of proofs. And we're going to look at the different kinds of judgments. The text goes into the rational judgments, and it doesn't talk about the other two. I'll touch on the first two a little bit now, and we'll touch on them some more in the next class before we go into the rational judgments. You know, some people really like this kind of stuff. Other people, they're bored out of their minds. But really, if you learn this well, then studying Aqidah becomes very easy, very intuitive, and it's not complicated at all. Not in the beginner level, and hardly in the intermediate level. It's only in the advanced levels where it gets a little complicated, because one has to go further with these rational arguments and no logic and things like that. Okay. Judgments, we define the term judgment. There are three kinds of judgments. And we alluded to them earlier. The first kind of judgment, we'll start with the easiest one. Since we are in the masjid and people learn their deen, we'll look at the legal judgment. The legal judgment is called al-hukmu al-shar'i. Al-hukm al-shar'i, the legal judgment. So that's also a nisbah, that's also an ascription. That root meaning of hukum still applies. It is ascribing one thing to another or negating one thing from another. Only here it's in the domain of sharia. Therefore, the hukum shar'i, we're looking at what is obligatory, wajib. We're looking at what is haram, unlawful. We're looking at what is mustahab, recommended. We're looking at what is makruh, disliked. And we're looking at what is mubah, neutral. These five are the five different legal judgments we have in Sharia. When these five legal judgments inform everything we say and do and omit in our lives. Getting up, praying Fajr on time, it's wajib. Eating onions and garlic before coming to the masjid, makruh. Praying your sunnah prayers, mustahab. Drinking alcohol, haram. Wearing a purple baseball cap, mubah, neutral. That's the legal judgment. We're not studying the legal judgments in Aqidah. However, in the beginning of this text, we do learn one legal judgment. Does anyone remember what that is? Right, the first obligation. يعني أول واجب على من كلف ممكنا من نظر أن يعرف الله والرسول بالصفات مما عليه نصب الآيات. The first obligation, it's mentioned in the books of Aqidah. They mention one hukum shar'i. The first obligation at the attainment of youth, to know Allah Ta'ala. That's a wajib. That's a hukum shar'i. Now the second category of judgments is what we call hukum adi. We're going to have a whole class on this one, along with the third one. The hukum adi is what we call an empirical judgment or a scientific judgment. It's based on cause and effect. So, you drink water when you're thirsty, it quenches your thirst. You pick something up and drop it, it'll hit the ground, gravity. When you are hungry and you eat, you get full. When you go outside and it's cold, you put on a jacket, you get warm. The hukm adi is the empirical judgment. It's a judgment arrived at through observation, experimentation, repetition. This is the domain of science. Science, do I have any doctors here? Any scientists here? Science is the domain of the hukm adi. It's trying to establish what is the hukm adi, the empirical judgment, in something. When a person is looking for developing a new medicine for some illness, they're trying to experiment with different compounds to find out if this thing will be effective in treating a certain illness. It's through trial and error, tajriba, takrar. And through that they arrive at a pattern. They establish the pattern that this thing happens all the time, and it doesn't really err from that. Now we'll go into more detail about this, because the hukm adi is not the same thing as the rational judgment, and a lot of people mix between the two. So I'm just giving you a really brief overview at the end of the class today. The last judgment is the rational judgment, al-hukm al-aqli, the judgment of the aql.
Hukm adi is the second one. First is the legal.
Legal judgment. Yeah. So don't, if you're still wrestling with these terms right now, don't worry. We're going to give a whole independent class on these. The hukm adi and hukm aqli we're going to talk about in great detail. The hukm shar'i, we already know what that is. The hukm aqli is not based on experimentation. It's not based on observing nature. It's not based on trial and error. It's based on the rational mind, what we call first principles. 1 + 1 = 7, right? No, it equals 2. Is it possible that 1 + 1 could equal 7? I mean 1, an undivided 1. I don't want any fancy high-level math where they use the word 1 and they mean something else. Adding 1. 1 + 1 is 2. It couldn't equal 3. We call that a rational necessity. It cannot be other than that. A square circle. Can there be such a thing as a square circle? No. That's a rational impossibility. The mind, you can conceive of it, but you know that it's not possible. And then a floating mouse. Floating in midair. Is that possible? Is it rationally possible? Oh, see, I got you there.
Well, it depends on what he's floating.
Okay. Well, his name is Mighty Mouse, for those who remember that cartoon. He's floating in midair. He's carrying a 1-ton bag of cotton candy, and yeah. Is that rationally possible? Why not?
Somebody imagine it.
Whenever I teach these, the categories, every single time, the same essential confusion between hukm adi and hukm aqli occurs. Scientific. Can your mind conceive of it?
Yes.
That means it's possible. That doesn't mean it's going to happen.
No, but it's a possibility.
Now, let's go back to the other one, the other judgment, the empirical judgment. Okay, let's go to something a little easier. Doesn't involve such imagination. A waterfall. We call it fall, but water that is flowing upwards. Is that possible? It is rationally possible, is it? Absent any other intervention by technology, just in nature, is it possible for water to flow upwards? Without technology, without anything that's altering the ordinary laws of gravity. Is it possible? Empirically, it's not possible. It has not been observed. So we say that's not possible empirically. Adatan, it's not possible. But the mind can conceive of it. Right? Okay, I'll give one final example before we end class. And it should all come home with this one. With Allah, all things is possible.
I think there is a waterfall that flows upward.
But, yeah, okay. So let's simplify it. There's water in...
Possible. Like, I remember seeing this on the nature show.
Right, so when you make these judgments, you have to remove all of these other extraneous details that could make it possible. Let's give something else. The water in your bottle. Just flowing upwards outside of any intervention. Rationally, that is possible. Empirically, right? Or you take it and you pour it out, and instead of it falling down, it goes up. You can pour that water out, you could try it 1 billion times, and it's always going to hit the ground. Is it possible though that... No, we're adding in all those details. You're on Earth and you pour it, and 1 billion times it's going to fall on the ground. But it's possible though that on that one time you could pour it out and it goes up. That would be called a break with the patterns of nature. Kharqul aada. And that is a miracle. Right? Okay, a stick. If you have a stick, I don't have a stick here. If I have a stick and I let go of it, it will drop. And I pick it back up and I drop it. I drop it 1 billion times and it always falls to the ground. Every time I throw it down, it falls. And I pick it back up as a stick. Does it always have to do that? No. Has there ever been a time in history where a stick has been dropped to the ground and that didn't happen? When Musa alayhi salam threw down the staff. So that is the break with the natural phenomena. That's when the hukm adi, the empirical judgment, is based on observation, cause and effect, patterns. But those patterns can be broken. There's nothing necessary about that happening. And we see when they're broken, they're called miracles, or they're called marvels. There's different types. And we're going to talk more about this in the next class. Because when you understand that at a deeper level, you recognize that everything's a miracle. Because there's nothing to say that drinking water out of that water bottle should quench your thirst. Maybe you drink the water and you float away. Maybe tomorrow you eat dinner and you turn to the size of a chickpea. Maybe you then go to sleep and you wake up a frog. All of that is possible. But there's patterns to existence. Without those patterns, you couldn't live life. You couldn't do anything. We cannot live our purpose without cause and effect and predictability. And that predictability is a blessing from Allah Ta'ala. And that's why it's so important for our own mental health. They say that people who suffer from depression, one of the first things they should do is have a set routine where they get up at the same time every day. Because the routines give them grounding. Right? So that's ada, that's the patterns of existence. Now, a lot of people confuse between these two, and that's what happened here. When I asked about Mighty Mouse, you were saying it's rationally impossible. And no, it's completely possible, rationally. The mind can conceive of it. Mighty Mouse floating in the sky with a 1-ton container of cotton candy is not the same thing as saying 1 + 1 is 7. One can be conceived. The other one can never be conceived. It's absolutely impossible. But we don't observe that. Is there any chance that a mouse could be floating really high in the sky with a cape and carrying cotton candy? Probably not. But it's not inconceivable to the rational mind. So we're going to talk about these three because I guess it all kind of begs the question, doesn't it? We're studying Aqeedah. Why learn these things? Why learn the rational judgments? Well, the simple answer is you cannot make a circular argument that goes around in circles. You can't say, I believe in God because God says He exists in the Quran. Well, how do you believe in the Quran? Well, because God says that the Quran is His book. That's circular. If a person comes to you and doesn't believe in the Quran, you can't use that kind of argument, and you can't use it for yourself. So we have to learn the rational judgments. We'll talk more about that in the next class, inshallah. We'll do a review of what's on the board here, a review of hukum, and then we'll go straight into talking about the empirical judgment and rational judgment, because the rational judgment is three types, right? So we're drawing a tree of sorts. We'll draw that tree out. Once we learn the rational judgments, which we'll be reading from the text, from the poem, we'll then go into covering of those three judgments, what is rationally necessary for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what is rationally impossible, and what is possible. And then we'll learn the rational proofs and the Quranic proofs and hadith proofs for all of those beliefs. And then we do the same thing for the messengers. And that's the Aqeedah, alhamdulillah.
We do in next class the rational judgment is also three types.
Yeah, so rational judgment on its own, necessary, possible, impossible. For empirical judgment, it's the same thing, but it's established differently. Something is empirically impossible because no matter how many times you do it, it doesn't happen. You pour water out of your cup, it doesn't flow up. It's possible.
1 + 1 = 2 is empirical judgment?
No, it's rational. Yeah, it's rational judgment. We call that first principles. Yeah. We'll get into that in a lot of detail. When you learn this stuff really well, you go through countless examples. I'm going to give you homework where you have to give me multiple rational impossibilities, multiple things that are rationally necessary. Possibilities are easy. Anything you observe, possible. But the two, necessary and impossible, require some thinking. Once you can easily determine what is rationally possible and rationally impossible, the world changes. It's like the Matrix. You see lots of people talking absolute absurdities and they don't even realize it. No. Khair, any questions before we break? Alhamdulillah. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم.